A child sits on a throne of gold and carved oak, his feet dangling, unable to touch the marble floor. He is 10 years old. In his small hand, he holds a quill, its feather twice the length of his forearm. A heavy parchment is laid before him, covered in elegant, looping script he can barely read. An advisor, a man with eyes like chips of flint, points to a space at the bottom. The boy is told to sign. He doesn't know what the words mean. Something about treason, about lands and titles being forfeit. He only knows that the man whose name is written on the document gave him a carved wooden horse last Christmas. He dips the quill, the ink staining his fingers, and signs a death warrant. This wasn't a game. This was not a flight of fantasy. This was the reality for the children who ruled Europe, the boy kings whose reigns were often short, brutal, and steeped in a horror that no fairy tale could ever capture. They were the most powerful individuals in their kingdoms, and yet the most powerless people imaginable. They were living paradoxes, divine symbols trapped in the vulnerable bodies of children, surrounded by adults who saw them not as sons or nephews, but as pawns in a lethal game of power. Their stories are not tales of wisdom and glory. They are the secret histories of Europe, written in whispers, sealed in blood, and hidden in the dark corners of castles where the screams of children were muffled by tapestries and the weight of a crown. To understand this world, we must first travel to a place of burning sun, holy fervor, and constant, simmering violence, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century. This was a sliver of Christendom carved into the heart of the Islamic world, an outpost of faith that lived on a knife's edge. Here kings were not just rulers, they were warriors, defenders of a fragile dream. And in 1174, the crown of this precarious kingdom fell upon the head of a boy who was just 13 years old. His name was Baldwin IV, but history would remember him by a different, more tragic title, the Leper King. His story doesn't begin with a coronation, but with a moment of horrifying discovery in the fields outside the city of Jerusalem. As a child, Baldwin was playing with the sons of nobles, a rough and tumble game of mock combat. The boys would dig their fingernails into each other's arms, testing their endurance, seeing who would cry out first. But when it was Baldwin's turn, he felt nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He smiled, thinking it was a sign of his strength, his princely fortitude. His tutor, the great historian William of Tyre, saw it differently. He saw not strength, but a terrifying absence. He tested the boy again, pinching his arm, then piercing it with a needle. Baldwin's face remained placid. He felt no pain. It was the first sign of the insidious disease that was already consuming him from within. A death sentence delivered to a child who had not yet even begun to live. Hansen's disease, leprosy, was a walking death. It was a disease of biblical terror, seen as a divine punishment for sin. It meant slow, inexorable decay, the loss of sensation, the thickening of the skin, the disfigurement of the features, blindness, the loss of fingers and toes. For a king, especially a warrior king in a kingdom that demanded physical prowess, it was the ultimate catastrophe. At 13, when he was crowned, the disease was still in its early stages, a secret kept within the high walls of the court. He was a handsome boy, intelligent and determined. But every morning, he would wake to a fresh horror. A new numbness in his hand, a strange lesion on his skin. He was a king racing against the slow, merciless invasion of his own body. Around him, the vultures gathered. The nobles of the kingdom, men like Raymond of Tripoli, his own regent, began to maneuver, seeing not a king to be served, but a dying obstacle to be overcome. They saw his inevitable death as an opportunity. His sister, Sibylla, was the key. Whoever married her would likely rule after Baldwin's death. The court became a nest of vipers, with factions forming around potential suitors, each one whispering poison about the others. And all the while, on the borders of the kingdom, the greatest Islamic warrior of the age was unifying his people under a single banner of jihad, Saladin. He saw the fractious, divided kingdom of Jerusalem, led by a sick boy, and knew his moment was coming. In 1177, Baldwin was 16. The disease had progressed. His face was beginning to show the leonine features of leprosy. He could no longer effectively wield a sword with his right hand, which was now clawed and numb. Saladin, seizing the opportunity, invaded the kingdom with an army of over 26,000 elite soldiers. He swept past the southern fortresses, believing the Christians were too weak and divided to mount a defense. He was marching on Jerusalem itself. Inside the city, there was panic. The Christian forces were scattered. All that could be mustered was a tiny army of a few hundred knights and a few thousand infantry. At their head was a 16-year-old boy ravaged by a horrifying disease. Any rational advisor would have told him to stay behind the walls, to negotiate, to surrender. But Baldwin was not rational. He was a king. He had himself strapped to his horse. He couldn't hold a sword, but he could hold the reins. He could lead. He led his pathetic, outnumbered force out of Jerusalem, not to defend, but to attack. He intercepted Saladin's massive army at a place called Montchesard. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Baldwin, unable to fight himself, commanded from the front. Before the battle, the boy king, his face likely already masked to hide his disfigurement, had the Bishop of Bethlehem raise a relic of the true cross before the troops. He dismounted, or rather, was helped from his horse, and prostrated himself on the ground, praying for victory. The sight of their afflicted king, their boy, praying in the dirt before God, and in the face of an overwhelming enemy, electrified the Christian knights. They charged with a fury born of desperation and holy zeal. The much larger, overconfident army of Saladin, caught completely by surprise, broke and fled. It was a slaughter. A victory so total, so improbable, it was seen as a miracle. The 16-year-old leper had defeated the great Saladin. He had saved his kingdom, but the victory was a temporary reprieve. The disease, like Saladin, was an enemy that would never stop attacking. It marched relentlessly across his body. As the years passed, Baldwin's condition worsened terribly. He went blind. His hands and feet became ulcerated stumps. He could no longer walk or ride. He had to be carried everywhere on a litter, a living corpse hidden behind curtains. Yet his mind remained sharp, his will unbroken. From his darkened, pain-racked world, he continued to rule. He dictated letters, he adjudicated disputes, he planned defenses. He was a mind, a will, trapped in a ruined vessel. The court intrigue grew more venomous. His sister Sibylla married a handsome, but arrogant and foolish French nobleman, Guy de Lusignan. Baldwin despised him, knowing Guy was utterly incompetent and would lead the kingdom to ruin. In one of the most poignant and terrible scenes of his reign, Baldwin, now completely incapacitated, tried to annul the marriage. He even tried to have Guy arrested. Lying on his litter, blind and immobile, he ordered his men to pull down the gates of Ascalon to get to Guy. But his authority, once absolute, was now being challenged by the very people who should have been his protectors. They were no longer listening to the dying king. They were listening to the whispers of his successor. He was forced to watch, helpless, as the man he knew would be their doom was positioned to take the throne. In a final, desperate act to secure the future of his kingdom, he had his nephew, Sibylla's young son, crowned as co-king. The image is heartbreaking, the dying, shrouded leper king, sitting next to a 5-year-old boy, both of them wearing crowns, both of them symbols, both of them doomed. Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his disease in 1185. He was just 24 years old. He had been king for 11 years, every single day a battle against his own flesh. His nephew, the child king Baldwin IV, would die just a year later, paving the way for Sibylla and the disastrous Guy de Lusignan to take power. 2 years after that, at the Battle of Hattin, Guy would lead the army of Jerusalem into a trap where it was completely annihilated by Saladin. Jerusalem fell. The kingdom was lost. Baldwin's miracle at Montchesard, his entire life's struggle, had been undone in a single afternoon by the greed and stupidity of the adults around him. The leper king had been more of a man than any of them. A boy who fought a war on 2 fronts, one against the greatest warrior of the age, and a more terrible intimate war against the cells of his own body. He won the first, but no one could win the second. His life was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, but also a dark lesson in how even the strongest will can be broken by the ambitions of those who wait for a king to die. But while Baldwin's enemies circled him from the outside, other boy kings would find that the most dangerous predators were not in a rival army, but in their own family sharing their own blood. We leave the sun-scorched sands of the Holy Land, and travel 3 centuries forward to the damp, green, and treacherous landscape of 15th century England. The year is 1483. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal 30-year civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, had finally sputtered to a close. King Edward IV, a formidable warrior and charismatic leader from the House of York, sat securely on the throne. His reign had brought a fragile peace to a blood-soaked nation. And then, suddenly he died. He was just 40 years old, struck down by a sudden illness. His death plunged the kingdom back into the uncertainty and paranoia that it had only just escaped. And at the heart of this new storm was his son, now King Edward V. He was 12 years old. Edward was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border when he heard the news of his father's death and his own accession. He was a boy raised in privilege, educated to be a king, but shielded from the brutal realities of power his father had navigated. He was now the most important piece on the English chessboard. With him was his maternal family, the Woodvilles. His mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, was ambitious and widely disliked by the old nobility, who saw her and her relatives as grasping upstarts. They immediately began to make plans to escort the new king to London for his coronation, intending to consolidate their power and rule in his name. But there was another power player, the late king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a man forged in the crucible of the Wars of the Roses. He was his brother's most loyal general, a proven commander, and a ruthless politician. He was also named in Edward IV's World Protector, tasked with governing the realm until his young nephew came of age. Richard heard of his brother's death while in the north of England. He also heard that the Woodvilles were racing to London with the king, intending to bypass his authority as protector. For Richard, this was a threat, a challenge. He rode south with a retinue of armed men. The two parties met at Stony Stratford. What happened next began as a courtly greeting and ended as a coup. Richard, bowing low before his nephew the king, arrested Edward's uncle, Earl Rivers, and his half-brother, Richard Grey. He told the terrified 12-year-old that these men were traitors, plotting against him. The boy king wept, but he was powerless. His protectors were taken away in chains. He was now under the complete control of his other uncle, Richard of Gloucester. Richard assured everyone this was a necessary measure to secure the kingdom and protect the king. He brought Edward V to London, where he was lodged in the royal apartments within the Tower of London. At the time, this was not necessarily sinister. The Tower was a royal palace as well as a fortress, and it was traditional for a new monarch to stay there before their coronation. But the date for the coronation kept being pushed back. Then Richard made his next move. He addressed the council, arguing that for the king's own safety, his younger brother, the 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, should join him in the Tower. The boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her other children. Sensing the trap closing, she refused, but she was pressured, cajoled, and threatened until she finally relented. The little duke was handed over, and now Richard had them both. The two legitimate male heirs of Edward IV were under his lock and key in the Tower of London. From that moment on, the story descends into shadow and silence. The boys were seen less and less frequently. At first, they were spotted playing in the Tower gardens. Then, they were seen only as pale faces in a barred window, and then they were not seen at all. While the princes were fading from public view, Richard was executing a masterful and ruthless propaganda campaign. He had the Woodville relatives, who had been arrested at Stony Stratford, executed without trial. He then brought forth a priest, a man named Ralph Shah, to preach a sermon at Stackpole's Cross. The sermon's message was a bombshell that rocked the kingdom to its core. Shah declared that the late King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. He claimed Edward had a pre-existing marriage contract with another woman, making his children with Elizabeth illegitimate bastards. And if the princes were illegitimate, they could not inherit the throne. The next in line, the sermon concluded, was the true, loyal, and legitimate heir, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Parliament was convened. Intimidated and presented with this evidence, they passed an act, the Titulus Regius, officially declaring the two princes illegitimate and offering the crown to Richard. He accepted with a great show of reluctance and was crowned King Richard III. The boys in the Tower were no longer a king and a prince. They were just Edward and Richard, the bastard sons of a dead king. Obstacles to be forgotten. And forgotten they were. What happened to them inside those cold stone walls is one of the greatest and most chilling mysteries in English history. They vanished. No public announcement of their death, no state funeral. Just silence. The silence itself is the most damning evidence. If they had died of natural causes, Richard III would have had every reason to display their bodies, to prove their deaths and quash any potential rebellions in their name. But he didn't. The most widely accepted theory then and now is that he ordered their murder. Imagine the scene. 2 boys, 12 and 9, alone in a stone room. They had been stripped of their titles, their friends, their family. The servants who once attended them were dismissed, replaced by men loyal only to their uncle. Did they know what was coming? Did they huddle together in the dark, listening to the footsteps approaching their door? The account given by Sir Thomas More, writing decades later, but claiming to have spoken to men involved, is blood-curdling. He wrote that Richard hired 2 killers who came to the boys' chamber in the dead of night. They found the children asleep in their bed, clasped in each other's arms. The assassins, allegedly moved by a flicker of pity, smothered them with their pillows, pressing down until the last struggle ceased. Moore claims their bodies were then buried at the foot of a staircase within the tower. For centuries, this was just a story, Tudor propaganda designed to blacken Richard's name. But then, in 1674, nearly 200 years later, workmen were renovating a staircase in the White Tower. Underneath the stone steps, they found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children, matching the approximate ages of Edward and Richard. The bones were later interred in Westminster Abbey, treated as the remains of the lost princes. Scientific examinations in the 20th century confirmed they were the skeletons of 2 children of the correct age range, and there was evidence they were related. The mystery of the princes in the tower is the ultimate story of the boy king as a victim. Edward V's reign lasted only 86 days. He was never crowned. He never made a single political decision. His entire existence as king was merely a prelude to his own murder. He was a piece in a game, moved from Ludlow to London, from palace to prison, and finally into a shallow grave. His power was an illusion, his crown a target on his head. His life and death reveal a terrifying truth. For a child in a position of power, the greatest danger is not the foreign enemy, but the loving uncle who smiles while sharpening a knife. But what if the prison is not a stone tower? What if the enemy is not a rival or a relative? What happens when the curse of a dynasty is so profound that a boy king's very own body becomes his cage, and his entire life becomes a slow, public execution? A spectacle of decay that brings a global empire to its knees. For our final, most grotesque story, we must travel south to the stifling, hyper, pious, and deeply strange world of late 17th century Spain. The Spanish Empire, once the most powerful in the world, was a fading giant, groaning under the weight of its own glorious past. And in 1665, the fate of this empire was placed into the hands of a 4-year-old boy named Charles II. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Charles was not the product of love, or even simple dynastic ambition. He was the final, tragic result of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. For 200 years, the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family had obsessively intermarried. Uncles with nieces, first cousins with first cousins, to keep their vast lands and power consolidated within the family. The genetic result was a catastrophe. Charles II was more inbred than the product of a brother-sister union. His father and mother were uncle and niece. His famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could not chew his food properly. His tongue was so large he drooled constantly, and his speech was nearly incomprehensible. He was beset by a horrifying litany of physical and mental ailments. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8. He couldn't speak in coherent sentences until he was 4. He was sickly, epileptic, and perpetually on the verge of death. His childhood was not a childhood. It was a state of suspended animation. He was treated not as a person, but as a fragile, sacred object. He was never schooled, never disciplined, never washed. He was left in the care of women who coddled him, terrified that any strain might cause him to shatter. He would spend his days in the opulent, airless rooms of the Alcazar of Madrid, playing with dolls, surrounded by relics and priests, a ghost haunting his own palace. Because the court could not comprehend the scientific reality of his condition, the concept of genetics was centuries away. They fell back on the only explanation they understood. Superstition. The king, they concluded, was bewitched. He was under a demonic spell, and so began one of the most bizarre and tragic chapters in royal history. The court of the most powerful empire on earth became consumed with finding a supernatural cure for a genetic disorder. Charles II, a confused and terrified child, and later a deeply disturbed young man, was subjected to endless, horrifying exorcisms, Priests would wave crucifixes at him, chanting litanies for hours on end. They would read the gospel over his shuddering body. They forced him to drink holy water and wear sachets of blessed herbs. One famous exorcist, a man named Fray Froil Cotton de Sointaz, became a dominant force at court. He conducted elaborate rituals, claiming to speak with demons who had possessed the king. These demons, speaking through the exorcist, would name various court members as co-conspirators in the bewitchment, leading to political purges and paranoia. Imagine the psychological torment for Charles. He was a boy who was already suffering physically and mentally, being told that his body was a battleground for celestial and infernal forces, that he was a vessel for evil. It reinforced his own sense of shame and inadequacy, turning his life into a living nightmare. His reign was a pathetic reflection of his own condition. He was a puppet king, a void at the center of government. Power was wielded by whoever could control him. First his mother, the Regent Mariana of Austria, and her cabal of advisors. Then his ambitious illegitimate half-brother, John of Austria the Younger, who staged a coup to seize power. After John's death, Charles remained a pawn, manipulated by his successive wives, and by French and Austrian factions at court, each one vying for influence. His two marriages were exercises in tragic futility. His first wife, the beautiful French Princess Marie-Louise d'Orléans, was initially horrified by him, but grew to pity and even feel affection for him. Her failure to produce an heir, which was due to Charles's impotence and sterility, was blamed on her. She died young, rumored to have been poisoned by the Austrian faction, who wanted a German queen on the throne. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was a domineering woman who controlled him completely, faking pregnancies and manipulating his hopes to maintain her own power. The entire continent of Europe held its breath, watching this slow-motion disaster unfold. The question on every monarch's lips was, who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire when the childless Charles finally died? The succession of Spain was the single most important geopolitical issue of the age. France and the Holy Roman Empire both had legitimate claims through marriage, and the prospect of either one inheriting Spain's territories in Italy, the Netherlands and the Americas threatened to completely upend the balance of power. Diplomats swarmed Madrid, bribing, threatening and spying, all circling the dying king like vultures. In his final years, Charles's decay became even more pronounced and macabre. His health collapsed completely. He was racked by seizures, his mind wandering. In a final, ghoulish act, driven by a morbid obsession with his family's mortality, he ordered the tombs of his ancestors in the royal crypt of El Escorial to be opened. He went down into the vault and looked upon the decaying corpses of his mother, his first wife, and his other relatives, weeping over their remains. It was a man at the absolute end of his rope, seeking comfort among the dead because his life had been a living hell. In late 1700, at the age of just 38, Charles II died. He looked like an ancient man. His autopsy report is a horrifying document, stating that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. His last coherent act was to dictate a will. Pressured by the French faction at court, he named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the powerful King Louis IV of France, as his sole heir. When the news reached the other courts of Europe, the result was immediate and catastrophic. The coalition led by the Austrian Habsburgs and their allies refused to accept a French prince on the Spanish throne. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a 13-year global conflict that drew in every major European power and resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people. The tragic, pathetic life of one boy king, a life defined by genetic decay and superstitious torment, had plunged the entire continent into one of the most devastating wars it had ever known. The stories of Baldwin, Edward, and Charles are not anomalies. They are extreme examples of a recurring pattern in history. They reveal the fundamental, tragic flaw at the heart of hereditary monarchy. The crown must always pass to the next in line, regardless of their age, their health, or their ability to rule. It is a system that prioritizes blood over competence, symbol over substance. For every boy king who survived to become a great ruler, like Louis IV of France who endured the Fronde Rebellion in his youth, to become the Sunday king, there are countless others whose lives were exercises in tragedy. They were prisoners of their own gilded cages. Baldwin was a prisoner of his own decaying body. Edward was a prisoner of his uncle's ambition, and the cold stone of the tower. Charles was a prisoner of his own twisted genetics and the suffocating piety of his court. They held the ultimate power in theory, but in reality, they were utterly defenseless. They were surrounded by adults who coveted their power, who saw them not as children to be nurtured, but as instruments to be used, or obstacles to be removed. Remember the 10-year-old boy we saw at the beginning, signing a death warrant with a hand stained by ink. That image is the key to understanding their secret lives. For these children, ascending the throne was not a moment of glory. It was the moment their childhood ended, and their own slow execution began, whether by disease, by an assassin's pillow, or by the slow rot of a cursed bloodline. The crown they wore was not a symbol of their divine right to rule. It was the heaviest, most ornate, and most inescapable tombstone in the world.